Hello, my name's Phil Doran, and with my partner Sean Wheeler, we run this company, Freight Training. Thanks for finding the time to listen to this presentation, which is a brief overview of one of our trade flow diagrams, in this case flowchart number 5, which deals with the subject of commercial terms, with specific reference to the Incoterms rules. The Incoterms rules are the work of the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, and our flow diagram is designed to be used in conjunction with that work. The principle behind trade terms is very simple, and it's represented by this diagram, where we assume that a seller in one country enters into a sales contract with a buyer in another, and between them they appoint a carrier, an airline, a shipping line, a freight forwarder, etc., and later the cargo leaves the country of supply and arrives in the country of destination, where a local agent of the carrier facilitates release and perhaps final delivery. Now, when the contract was formed, the buyer and seller settled on a price for the underlying goods. This price, they know, includes the cargo itself, but the seller and buyer both know also that there will be further costs, further risks, and further tasks involved in getting the cargo from A to B, from the seller to the buyer. And they need to be sure that they agree on which of these costs and risks are already in the seller's price. For example, the export customs paperwork. Is that included in the seller's price? How about insurance? Is that included? And for the price quoted, must the buyer collect the cargo from the seller's country, or has the seller built the freight costs into this price already? It may even be possible that the seller's price includes the buyer's import customs clearance costs, in part or in full. That is, the price that's being quoted could be the price on the seller's shelf, or it may be the price on the buyer's shelf, or any point in between these two extremes. Now, traditionally, buyers and sellers tried to bring certainty to this matter by giving their various agreements different names. That is to say, they used a commercial term to distinguish the contract, on the understanding that a different name meant a different division of the known risks and costs. Well, a tradition developed of using abbreviations, at least mostly, to describe these various terms. But as there was and is no universal system in place to standardize what these various terms may mean, local variations developed and brought uncertainty to the contract. Well, one of the ways around this for the modern trader is for the parties to settle on an agreed definition, and that's where the Incoterms rules become so effective, bringing a single and consistent definition to the trade terms, which in turn brings certainty to what is and what is not included in the specific areas of the sales contract. Now, this system was developed by the ICC in Paris, who published their work in many languages, making the trade terms a determinable feature of many types of sales agreement. But as trade changes, so too must the terms which describe it, and the latest version of these frequently revised rules is published under the name of Incoterms 2010, and you may want to visit the ICC website for further information on this and many other of their trade-related products. This diagram shows where these terms divide the contract, and while it may look complicated, it's really fairly simple. The rules are linked to physical activity as much as contractual intention, and the average party in trade finds that perhaps only 2 or 3 of these terms are applicable to their particular endeavours. One group of these terms deals with any form of transport. These are referred to as being omnimodal, whereas a second and older group of terms deals only with the single form of carriage, being sea freight. Now, where the flow diagram comes in useful is that it is a decision tree, a series of simple step-by-step questions posed to you where the answer may be only yes or no, and whereby, if you follow the decision tree correctly, you can be led to the correct commercial term to name your contract. And from this, you will then readily be able to reference to the Incoterm rules to find which one talks to your type of physical operation. It's just a simple process of questions and answers. This symbol here is the Incoterms rule. Note it's a symbol, and the English name for this symbol is, in this example, X works. In your copy of the Incoterms rules, you'll find the detail of this particular term on page 15, and the term may be used for any mode of transport, so air, sea, road, rail, or any combination thereof. But how did you know to reference to the EXW rule as opposed to any of the others? Well, this is where the flow diagram assists. All it is, remember, is a series of questions, and you begin at the top with this one. does the seller's price include the freight? Or by freight we mean, is the seller paying the carrier for the main carriage? The answer can only be yes or no. Well, in our example, the answer is no. So now we have a second question, and that is delivery at the seller's works? Is the buyer, in other words, collecting from the seller's works, his factory, his warehouse? Again, the answer can only be yes or no, and in our example, it's yes. So again, this leads to a further question, and that is, does the seller's price include the export customs paperwork? Is the seller going to act as the exporter? Yes or no? Well, if your answer is no, then that indicates you have an Incoterms EXW rule, and the side panel takes you to our standard transport chain and indicates roughly where risks and costs will divide in such an example. And now you can refer to the Incoterms rules in detail, referencing to page 15 of the text to consider EXW in all of its detail. Some of the rules, like this one, FCA, are very versatile, but they can be complex as a consequence. For example, if you refer to sections A4 and B4 on page 26 of your book, there's a possible variation on the moment of delivery, where it may be the moment of handover at the seller's premises, or at another place in the country of supply. That is to say, where the seller must take the cargo to the buyer's carrier. Now, that variable is determined on the flow diagram in the following sequence. We begin by asking, does the seller's price include the freight? Well, in either instance of FCA, the answer would be no. So, is delivery at the seller's works? Well, in one variation of FCA, the answer is clearly yes. So now, does the seller's price include the risk and cost of export customs? Well, with FCA it does, so again the answer is now yes, and that takes us to FCA, and from there to the appropriate diagram. But what if the intention had been for the seller to take it to the buyer's carrier? Well, then, when we get to the question, is delivery at the seller's works, we would now answer no. And now we're asked if the point of handover is a terminal. Well, let's say that the point of handover is the carrier's yard or the carrier's warehouse, which isn't a terminal, where a terminal, of course, is the likes of a port or an airport. Well, this also leads us to FCA, but a different type of FCA on the diagram. Here, FCA 1 refers to handover at the seller's works, whereas FCA 2 refers to handover at the carrier's premises, a place where the seller has to take the cargo to. But because FCA is so versatile, the point of handover could even be in a terminal, a port or an airport, and then again either in that terminal or on the main transport that is positioned within or at the terminal itself, loaded on a ship, for example, loaded on the aircraft, on the means of transport. So on the means of transport, therefore, could be in the terminal, or it could even be on the main carriage. I'll come back to that point later on. There are some very old trade terms that are still used, such as this. This is in regular use after generations. Now, this type of term are all monomodal rules in that they're restricted to one form of transport, sea freight, the oldest form of transport associated with commercial terms. These terms are dealt with in the second part of the publication, deeper into the book. Perhaps the best known of these is the FOB rule currently on your screen. Well, it's important to note that Incoterms cautions the modern trader that such old terms, although still in use in some parts of the world, are not necessarily appropriate to many forms of modern sea freight activity. Sure, using the flow diagram, if the point of handover is a terminal, and if delivery is specifically alongside a docked vessel, then the diagram will indicate the use of FAS. But then it also suggests that you may achieve the same type of contract by using a more modern rule, the rule of FCA. And when you look at the diagrams, they're physically very similar contracts. It now depends on your reading of the specific text of the Incoterms rules to determine which of the two represents your intentions best. Exactly the same principle applies to FOB, where FCA is often a better, more modern alternative. We can only emphasize here that the flow diagram can take you so far in the use of these rules, but it's down to your understanding of the text and only the text when it comes to making your contractual decision. When to use which rule depends on your intentions. In our experience, it's the next group of terms, those that begin with the letter C, which tend to cause the most confusion for traders as they're distinctly different from other types of term. Although we start with the same question, does the seller's cost include the freight? Our answer will now be yes. However, it's the second question, around risk, which needs to be understood. Is the seller taking the risk of non-arrival? We've set aside a separate panel on the diagram to explain this question in more detail. That's if you're uncertain of its meaning. And if you then find that your answer is no, you will be working with C prefixed terms as opposed to D prefixed terms. Again, we have some old examples of these trade terms, such as cost and freight, which is expressed CFR as an Incoterms rule, and CIF standing for cost, insurance and freight. You will note that once you have answered the next question regarding insurance, then regardless of you answering yes or no, the very next question, that of is delivery on a ship in the origin port, will repeat on either side. This is because we have omnimodal terms such as CPT, carriage paid to, and CIP, carriage and insurance paid, both of which mirror CFR and CIF. They obviously have the exception that they may be used for any form of transport, including sea freight. So again, you will have an either-or option sometimes on the flow diagram. But whichever one you settle on, there are diagrams to illustrate the point further. Now, these diagrams illustrate that risk and cost are different issues, and this is the complexity developed further on the side panel of the flow diagram. Be sure you understand this specific point when working with any of the C prefixed terms, that the passage of risk and the passage of cost are distinctly separate. The final group of terms differ from the C prefixes in that risk and cost are simultaneous events, just like with the E and F prefix terms we began with. The first of these is a new term, DAT, delivered at terminal. Again, the crucial question is the seller taking the risk of non-arrival? But unlike with the C prefixes, the answer is now yes. Yes, the seller is taking the transit risk to the place of destination. Then the question is the place of delivery a terminal, a seaport or an airport, for example? Well, if the answer is yes, then again, does the seller's risk and cost include the discharge of the cargo from the delivering transport at the named terminal? Again, the answer can only be yes or no. Here our answer is yes, and now we know we're dealing with a DAT, delivered at terminal, contract. The second and similar new term is DAP, delivered at place. It's similar up to asking the question of whether delivery is at a terminal or not. Only here, unlike DAT, although the answer could be yes, thereafter it is not the seller's intention to include discharge costs. And that leads us to one of two variations on DAP. The variation exists because perhaps delivery is not in a terminal, and if the seller's price does not include the risks and costs of import clearance, then we also have an Incoterms rule DAP as our contract term. So DAP appears twice. It all depends on whether we have a delivery undischarged at the terminal or a delivery undischarged beyond the terminal, deeper inland. So at the terminal or beyond the terminal, but not inside the terminal. That would be DAT. The final rule to consider is the omnimodal term DDP. Again, our flow diagram takes us down familiar questions associated with D terms up to the crucial question on whether the seller's costs and risks now include the local import duties and taxes, which with DDP it does. So, our final diagram. The Incoterms rules standardize the commonest forms of commercial term. They are of indispensable use to trade, but they only address one of the many contracts you can encounter in a trade transaction. And so the flow diagram cautions the user that there is more to it than just commercial terms alone. The need is always to harmonize the many contracts, those of sale, payment, transport, etc., towards a common purpose of risk management. One final reminder that the wall chart is not a substitute for the Incoterms rules themselves, and you're encouraged to secure a copy for your own use as well as to enhance the benefits of using this flow diagram. This is only one of a series you may be interested in, and you might wish to visit our website for more on the additional products we have. My name is Phil Doran, and on behalf of Sean Wheeler and myself, I'd like to thank you for considering our products. We both wish you well.